It was as if the whole world had stopped for a moment, suspended between what it had always believed and something that was slowly beginning to awaken. Dolores Cannon appears, not as a woman of flesh and blood, but as a consciousness that transcends time. Her voice doesn't reach the ears. It's felt in the center of the chest, like an ancient memory returning. She speaks of something everyone senses, but few dare to name, the moment when humanity begins to remember who it truly is. It all begins in a forgotten corner of the planet, a small village where life has repeated itself for generations. People wake up with the sunrise, travel the same dirt roads, and dream only of enough to survive. For centuries they have lived in scarcity, and yet within each one there is a glimmer that insists on shining. Dolores observes from afar and realizes it is not material poverty that imprisons, but the forgetting of one's own abundance. She understands that true misery is born when human beings disconnect from their origin, when they forget that they came from the same fabric of energy that creates stars, seas, and galaxies. A simple gesture changes everything. Someone, somewhere, decides to give without asking for anything in return. A small amount in the eyes of the world, $500, is given to each adult in that village. To those who receive it, it seems like a miracle. To those who observe, it's an experiment. For Dolores, it's a symbol. She explains that every exchange of energy carries a frequency. When one gives unconditionally, the universe reorganizes itself. When one offers something with an open heart, the very field of reality expands. That money, therefore, is not just a resource, it's a mirror. It reveals how much a human being believes they deserve. She observes the scene with a gaze that transcends dimensions. Each person holding the notes in their hands carries with them a silent choice: to continue believing in limitation or to allow the flow of creation to circulate again. Dolores knows that energy responds to consciousness. If someone believes they are small, the universe reflects that in scarcity. If someone remembers that they are part of the whole, the universe bends and multiplies. The act of giving, then, becomes an invocation. The village, previously invisible, begins to pulsate like a beacon. The simple act of receiving awakens something dormant, the forgotten power to co-create one's own reality. But the human mind hesitates. The ego asks, what if they waste it? What if they don't know how to use it? Dolores smiles. She knows these voices well. They are the same ones that echo in every era, in civilizations that considered themselves the owners of knowledge and solutions. She answers silently, nothing is wasted when there is learning. Even mistakes expand consciousness. In her view, there are no failures, only different stages of remembrance. Energy is not lost. It only changes form, moving between dimensions as understanding grows. The days go by. The village, once frozen in time, slowly changes. There is more laughter, more sharing, more hope. Dolores realizes that it is not money that has transformed the place, but the recognition that something is possible. When a human being feels seen, the frequency changes. When they believe, even for a moment, that they are worthy of prospering, the entire field rises. This is how reality reconstructs itself, not through imposition, but through vibration. She observes the faces, the hands, the eyes that now shine. Each person seems to carry a spark of creation, as if an ancient force were being reactivated. Dolores understands that the experiment is not about economics, but about memory. That village represents all of humanity, souls who have forgotten who they are, now beginning to remember. Abundance is not a privilege, but a natural state for those who live in harmony with their own spirit. She walks among them and speaks, but her words are not heard. They are felt. They speak of love, of free will, of conscious creation. You have never been separate from the source, she says. Everything that exists around you is an extension of your own consciousness. Scarcity is a collective illusion created by fear, sustained by repetition. And yet, a single act of faith is enough to break the cycle. Dolores closes her eyes and sees the vibrational field expanding around the village, as if the entire planet were breathing a little easier. She knows that what is happening there is a prelude to something greater, a reflection of the approaching global awakening. Each act of generosity, each reminder of unity, creates a crack in the illusion of separation. The money given to that village is merely the vehicle. The true gift is the recognition that energy moves where there is trust. But there is a question that echoes in the air, floating like a prayer. Is humanity ready to trust again? To trust others, to trust oneself, to trust the unseen? Dolores senses the answer coming from afar, like a wave that crosses time. She knows that the memory never disappears. It only awaits the right moment to emerge. Finally, the sun sets over the village, and the world seems the same. But nothing is the same. A field has been reactivated. A circuit of consciousness has been reconnected. Dolores watches and smiles. She knows that every small action contains the power to transform centuries of oblivion, that every gesture of love returns to humanity, a fragment of its own soul. And when silence covers the earth and the stars begin to appear, her voice returns, subtle, almost a whisper. You're not learning anything new, just remembering. There is something profoundly human about trying to fix the world. In every generation, men and women believe they can erase the suffering of others through planning, rules, structures, and statistics. Dolores Cannon observes this tendency with tenderness, and also with a certain sorrow. She sees a humanity that incessantly seeks solutions to pain, but almost always forgets to look at its origin. In her view, the error lies not in compassion, but in the distance between the helper and the helped. It is this distance that transforms the sacred gesture into control, and charity into an act of forgetfulness disguised as kindness. She speaks as she walks through the timelines, showing scenes that repeat themselves like reflections. Schools built with enthusiasm empty out after a few months. Wells drilled in arid villages dry up before a year has passed. Training programs teach techniques, but don't restore purpose. Dolores understands the pattern. These are attempts made from the surface, from the outside in, and what is born from the outside, however grand, cannot sustain what is wounded inside. The images shift. One shows a man sitting in front of a mud house, observing the hands that hold the little he possesses. He doesn't want much, only to understand why life seems to repeat itself like an unbreakable cycle. Elsewhere, a woman walks for hours to the nearest school to take her daughter, believing that there, perhaps, the future can be different. Dolores observes these souls and recognizes in them something that transcends matter. Each one is a spark trying to remember its own light, even shrouded in shadows. She then turns to the viewer, to the one who watches and thinks that none of this affects them. Look around, she whispers. The same pattern lives within you, and suddenly the story ceases to be distant. It is in the frustrated attempts to control one's own life, in the meticulous plans that crumble, in the expectations that are never fulfilled. How many times do we try to change something without first understanding what sustains it? How many times do we repeat the cycle of giving, helping, teaching, without realizing that, behind the gesture, there is still the belief that the other is lesser? Dolores explains that all help laden with superiority stems from a lack of awareness of unity. When someone believes they have more wisdom, more resources, or more moral standing than another, they sever the invisible thread that connects them. This is why so many grandiose projects fail. They are born from the fear of seeing one's own reflection in the other. You build bridges of gold, she says softly, but you forget that both banks are the same river. She says she has seen this pattern many times, in past lives, in forgotten civilizations, in worlds that flourished and crumbled under the weight of their own arrogance. They believed they could impose harmony through the force of reason, without understanding that harmony only flourishes when the heart is listened to. Dolores sees the same cycle repeating itself on modern Earth, with more technology, but with the same spiritual blindness. There is a brief silence. Then she shows something unexpected, a small room lit by cold lamps, where a group of researchers observes graphs and spreadsheets. They are trying to measure the impact of the aid, calculate the change, transform hope into data. She leans in slightly and says, "They seek numbers, but what changes doesn't fit into tables. Because the true impact doesn't happen when the statistics rise, but when an eye shines again, when someone feels capable of choosing, when the flame of free will is rekindled." Dolores recalls that, in her own journey, she learned to listen without haste. During her regression sessions, people told her stories of suffering, but also of reunion. Many believed they were reliving old traumas when, in fact, they were only seeing the reflection of something they had always known, that the purpose of pain is to awaken the memory of who we are. She realized that the same applies to humanity. All attempts to save others are, in essence, attempts to save oneself. She invites the viewer to imagine, what if every policy, every program, every grand plan were, at its core, a collective lesson. A lesson repeated until humanity finally understands that healing doesn't come from outside. Dolores says that the human soul learns by contrast. It needs to experience lack to value flow, distance to remember unity. The failure of past initiatives is not a defeat. It is the mirror reflecting the blind spot of consciousness. The scenes continue to overlap. A man plants seeds in dry soil. A child draws their own dream on the school wall. A woman prays before a lit candle. Dolores observes each gesture and explains that, even when nothing seems to change, something invisible is growing. Awakening rarely happens in absolute silence. It insinuates itself in small actions and simple choices, in the moments when someone believes, for the first time, that they are worthy of something better. She knows that future generations will look back and realize how necessary these attempts were. Each mistake paved a new step on the ladder of awareness. What once seemed like failure was merely preparing the ground for a different kind of learning, a learning that doesn't come from books but from inner memories. Dolores concludes the vision with a phrase that is not a warning but an invitation. Every time you try to teach someone else what they already know, you are only delaying their awakening. She looks towards the horizon, where time seems to dissolve into light. The village, the cities, the countries, everything blends into a single breath, and for a moment, the viewer feels the entire world pulsating within their own chest. The air becomes thick, almost electric. There's a feeling that something is about to be revealed, something that changes the way you understand help, love, and purpose. Dolores smiles, as if she already knows what's coming, and leaves only an echo in the air. What you call learning is merely the memory awakening again. Dolores Cannon observes the world as one reads an infinite tapestry, where each thread represents a life, and each intersection reveals a forgotten purpose. She understands that nothing happens in isolation. Everything vibrates in a network, in a synchronicity so precise that it escapes common logic. Every human gesture, even the simplest, reverberates in multiple directions. A thought of fear can fuel scarcity on the other side of the planet. An act of trust can open portals of abundance in places where the sun has long since ceased to shine. And it is in this invisible fabric that she begins to reveal the true mystery of the connection between souls. The energy of giving and receiving is not merely social or moral, it is cosmic. Dolores walks between dimensions and reveals a vision that few would dare to imagine. On a subtle plane, what we call economics is, in fact, a dance of frequencies. Each coin, each note, each act of exchange carries a vibrational signature. When someone gives with fear of losing, the surrounding field contracts. When someone gives with confidence, the field expands. This is why certain communities flourish even with few resources. In them, the consciousness is one of flow, not of lack. Abundance, she says, is not a matter of how much one has, but of how much one allows to flow. But what if we are all trapped in a cycle of containment? What if the real obstacle is not material inequality, but the collective fear of trusting? Dolores asks. But the question is also a mirror. How many times do we hold on to what we have too tightly, believing that if we let go, the universe won't bring it back? How many times do we repress the impulse to give, to help, to share, because we confuse caution with wisdom? She explains that this resistance is not just emotional, it's energetic. Every time a human being chooses scarcity, they lower their own vibration and disconnect from the flow of creation. The silence that follows is profound. Dolores shows the modern world, broadly lit cities, frenzied markets, people rushing with their eyes fixed on screens that never sleep. Humanity believes it has conquered everything, but continues to feel empty. You have replaced the sacred with the measurable, she murmurs, and forgotten that true wealth is the capacity to feel. She speaks of the illusion of independence, this myth that teaches the individual to see themselves as separate from the whole. However, no one prospers alone. Each soul is interconnected with another, forming a living web that reconfigures itself with every thought, every choice. Suddenly she pauses, as if listening to something that hasn't yet been said, and she asks, what would happen if everyone on Earth believed at the same time that they are already complete? What would change if the fear of tomorrow were replaced by the silent certainty that nothing is lacking? Dolores smiles, because she knows the answer. The entire system would crumble. Not through collapse, but through transmutation. The power structures based on scarcity and competition would lose their meaning. Economies would become mirrors of consciousness. Exchanges would flow naturally, like rivers meeting the sea. She then speaks about the concept of giving directly, but now on another level. It's no longer about sending resources from one country to another, but about restoring the original flow of universal energy. Giving is remembering that the other is an extension of oneself. When someone helps a soul in need, they are simply reorganizing the balance within their own energy field. Money, in this context, is a messenger of awakening, a neutral symbol that reveals the vibrational state of the one who uses it. In the hands of fear, it generates conflict. In the hands of love, it becomes a multiplier. But what if the real test isn't how much we give, but rather how much we trust in the return? Dolores says the universe is a self-regulating organism. Everything that is emitted returns at the same frequency. The problem is that humanity has learned to expect immediate returns, and this breaks the cycle. "You have forgotten divine patience," she comments. That certainty that what is sent returns when the soul is ready to receive it. This waiting is often confused with absence, but it is merely the necessary interval for the field to reorganize itself. Night falls in Dolores' vision, and she shows a distant village where simple people gather around a campfire. Each one recounts what they did with the little they received. A woman bought seeds, a young man repaired his roof, another paid for his brother's studies. None of this seems grand in the eyes of the world, but the energy is the same that moves galaxies, the vibration of care. Dolores explains that when action is born from pure intention, the universe responds on multiple levels. Helping others is a way of remembering that there is no other. She pauses for a moment and poses a provocative question. What if the entire planet were one big experiment in remembrance? What if the entire struggle for survival were merely the narrative we created to relearn the power of cooperation? The question echoes like a whisper within the listener. There is no immediate answer because it needs to mature in silence. Dolores simply observes and lets each person feel the impact of this idea within their own heart. Finally, she speaks of the true meaning of abundance, one that doesn't depend on achievements but on awareness. Abundance is the recognition that everything that exists is in constant exchange. The air that enters and leaves the lungs, the light that reflects in the eyes, the emotion that arises and dissolves. You live in an ocean of energy, she says, but you behave as if you fear dying of thirst. Each act of generosity is a drop returned to the sea, a reminder that the flow never ceases. Dolores slowly walks away, as if dissolving into the horizon of light. Her voice, however, remains. She doesn't tell you to believe or to follow. She only invites you to feel, to understand that every separation is temporary, and that every gesture of trust is a seed of awakening, planted in the quantum field of humanity. The wind blows, and the sound that remains is almost imperceptible, but it carries a meaning that transcends eras. When you give without fear, the entire universe will return to you the memory of who you are. Dolores Cannon reappears, walking among the echoes of time, and this time her presence is clearer, almost tangible. She observes the same village that once seemed forgotten, but now pulsates with an unexpected vitality. The houses have been repaired, local commerce flourishes, children run through the streets with smiles that once seemed improbable. There is something different in the air, a subtle vibration that alters even the rhythm of the wind. What was once an isolated experience transforms into a silent phenomenon, the collective awakening of a people who, without realizing it, had reconnected the invisible thread of abundance. The researchers return 2 years later and are astonished. Small business revenues have increased by more than 60%. Families eat better, sleep better, and plan for the future. Family disputes have decreased, and even alcohol consumption has fallen. Dolores observes and knows that the numbers are only the visible shadow of something much deeper. She sees the energetic layers that intertwine over that place, like an expanding luminous mesh. "You call it progress," she murmurs, "but it's just a memory." The story spreads. Other villages, other regions, other nations begin to test the same proposal, offering unconditional help. The world watches with skepticism, but the results keep repeating themselves. Local economies strengthen, unemployment falls, collective well-being grows. Dolores explains that these results are not a coincidence. They are a reflection of the field of trust being restored. When fear ceases to be the center of human decisions, natural balance is re-established. Energy follows intention, she says, and pure intentions create expansive realities. But something even more curious begins to happen. In neighboring regions that did not receive donations, the economy also improves. Small markets emerge, schools are renovated, and solidarity among people increases. It's as if prosperity were contagious. Dolores sees what scientists are still trying to understand. The vibration of an awakened group alters the field of everyone around it. A single point of light illuminates kilometers of shadow. It's not the money that flows, she explains. It's the frequency of recognition. When a part of humanity remembers its own capacity to create, that memory spreads like an invisible perfume. In one of her visions, Dolores observes something even more intriguing. Certain families, even after the project ends, continue to prosper spontaneously. They create new businesses, help other communities, and invest in education. For many, it's a miracle. For her, it's a natural law. These people have anchored a new consciousness. They understood that what they received was only a symbol. The true gift was the realization that they are co-creators. The energy that moves through gratitude doesn't disappear. It multiplies. She recounts a specific case that draws attention. A woman, a widow and mother of 3, used part of her money to buy an old sewing machine. Over time, she began sewing clothes for neighbors and, without realizing it, created a cooperative with other women in the village. Today, they produce pieces sold throughout the region. This is what happens when intention aligns with purpose, explains Dolores. Matter responds to the command of consciousness. The story becomes a symbol of what she has always taught. When someone awakens, they pull with them a whole group of souls that were asleep. However, not everything goes as expected. In some regions, some of the money is mismanaged, wasted on fleeting pleasures. Critics point out, this proves that giving without control is naive. Dolores, however, sees it differently. She affirms that even waste is a form of learning. Energy needs to circulate, and sometimes apparent excess is simply the way the soul learns the value of moderation. The universe neither punishes nor rewards, she says. It only mirrors. Today's mistake can be tomorrow's awakening, and each choice reveals the evolutionary stage of the person making it. While scientists debate the results and economists attempt to quantify the phenomenon, Dolores directs her gaze to a more subtle level. She sees that as people regain their dignity, the planetary field shifts. The frequency of global fear diminishes, albeit imperceptibly. This change resonates beyond physical borders, reaching distant countries, connecting hearts that have never touched. The entire planet seems to breathe differently. You think you're studying economics, she says, but what you're witnessing is the alchemy of consciousness in action. What is most surprising is that this transformation, even though measurable by data, follows a logic opposite to that of traditional models. Where there was hierarchy, cooperation is born. Where there was dependence, initiative emerges. What seemed like a humanitarian experiment reveals itself to be a silent revolution. Dolores understands that what began as a donation is, in fact, the beginning of a new era, one in which the power to create prosperity is no longer concentrated in governments or institutions, but in the hands of the people themselves. It is a reminder that the universe has always sustained those who believe. She closes her eyes and feels the energy field pulsing beneath her feet. Each village, each community that awakens, sends waves of light that traverse continents. It's not fantasy, she insists. It's quantum physics in its purest form. The conscious observer alters the observed object, and when millions of observers begin to see abundance where before they only saw scarcity, the very fabric of reality changes texture. Dolores says that's how a planet transforms, not through great external revolutions, but through a succession of small internal awakenings. And then she leaves a question hanging in the air, like an invitation. If a simple amount of money can generate such a transformation, what would happen if each person decided to offer the world what they possess that is most precious? Their attention, their presence, their faith. The wind calms, the silence becomes profound, and the feeling is that something has been planted within those who listen. Dolores slowly moves away, her figure dissolving into light, but her voice remains echoing in every awakened mind. Generosity is the original language of the universe. When you speak it again, everything around you begins to remember as well. Time passes, and what seemed like the beginning of a new era begins to reveal its nuances. Dolores Cannon observes attentively. The waves of prosperity that spread through villages and cities now face the natural force of the universal cycle. Everything that grows needs to find balance. In some places, abundance begins to dissipate, like a river changing course. Families that once prospered are once again facing difficulties. Small businesses are lost in debt, and the initial enthusiasm gives way to unease. For scholars, it is a mystery. For Dolores, it is simply a reflection of the law that governs all worlds, the cyclical movement of experience. Nothing is permanent, because everything that is alive needs to transform. She explains that humanity's collective consciousness is still learning to sustain the vibration of abundance. It's easy to receive it when it arrives, but difficult to maintain it when the mind begins to doubt again. Prosperity, she says, doesn't depend on what one has, but on the frequency at which one remains. When fear returns, energy contracts, and what once flowed naturally begins to disperse. You confuse stability with security, she murmurs. But the universe has never been stable. It pulsates, breathes, and remakes itself every instant. Dolores then presents an unexpected episode. In a Ugandan village, a group of families who had received donations prospered in the early years, but then lost everything. Years later, when the pandemic hit the world, these same families began to grow again. Without external support, they managed to restructure themselves, create solidarity networks, and sustain their own livelihoods. The researchers were surprised by the turnaround, but Dolores understood immediately. Those souls had learned to use chaos as a catalyst. The crisis for them was not a tragedy, but a force for realignment. When pain arrives, she says, it's just the soul moving to remember what it has forgotten. Tension rises when Dolores shows that not all lessons are gentle. In many regions, the return to scarcity generates conflict. There are accusations, resentments, blame. Some blame the system, others, fate. But she observes the scene with serenity. For her, the apparent regression is part of the learning process. You believe you are going backwards, but you are only preparing to take a more conscious step. Planetary consciousness, like a child learning to walk, needs to fall before finding its own rhythm. She invites the viewer to look at their own life and recognize the same pattern. How many times has what seemed like an achievement suddenly dissolved? How many times has stability been just a pause before change? Dolores explains that humanity carries a tendency to cling to forms, and that is why it suffers when they fall apart. The flow is not lost, she says. It just changes direction. Learning to follow this movement is the most difficult and also the most liberating lesson. The world seems to be going through a period of uncertainty. The initial enthusiasm for the power of direct donations is beginning to give way to deeper questions. To what extent can money actually change a consciousness? To what extent can a material action reshape a spiritual pattern? Dolores smiles with a twinkle in her eyes because she knows that the answer lies not in the numbers, but in the frequency. The energy of love, she affirms, is the only one that doesn't dissipate. When help springs from the heart, it leaves invisible seeds that germinate at different times. Even when the harvest seems to fail, the land has already been transformed. But there's a detail that no one notices, and that's where Dolores introduces the turning point. She reveals that, while scholars measure results and institutions discuss models, something much bigger is happening behind the scenes of the planet's energy. The act of giving without expectation has created a luminous rift in the collective field. A wave of empathy has swept through subtle dimensions, reconfiguring the pattern of fear that has dominated Earth for millennia. Humanity, unknowingly, has activated a mass healing process. Every gesture of generosity, even the forgotten ones, has become a particle of light that now pulsates in a network. For a few moments, Dolores falls silent. There's a tension in the air, a feeling that something is about to happen. She looks at the horizon and says that the coming years will bring the ultimate test. The planet is in transition, and everything that has been learned will be tested, not in laboratories but in real life. In daily decisions, in moments of crisis, in choices made in silence. The Earth is learning to trust again, she says, and every human being is a cell of this planetary consciousness. The pace quickens. Dolores shows visions of a near future, reorganized cities, autonomous communities, people exchanging resources without intermediaries, economies sustained by cooperation. But she also shows the opposite side, places where fear still dominates, where competition disguises itself as progress and greed tries to resurface. The two realities coexist, and the tension between them forms the proving ground of the new era. You are between two worlds, she explains. The old one based on scarcity and the new one based on remembering who you are. She walks between these two landscapes, feeling the weight and the promise of each. There is beauty and chaos, hope and doubt, creation and destruction. Dolores knows that it is at this point of contrast that awakening intensifies. The collapse of old systems is only the prelude to reconstruction. Humanity is being invited to sustain the vibration of abundance without depending on anything external. The true test, she says, is not to survive, but to remain awake even when everything around seems to crumble. The tension reaches its peak when Dolores asks, what if everything they lost was just what was preventing the new from being born? The question echoes like silent thunder. It's impossible not to feel a chill. For a moment, the mind wants answers, but the heart already understands. The world is falling apart to be reborn on another frequency, and when the light shines again on the scene, the viewer understands that they are about to cross the final threshold. Dolores smiles serenely and says, chaos is not the end, it's just the last reminder before complete remembrance. The world now seems to breathe at a different rhythm. After so many attempts, falls, and rediscoveries, humanity is beginning to realize that perhaps the true purpose was never to conquer poverty, but remember? The unit Dolores Cannon observes the planet with a serene gaze, like someone watching an ancient cycle come to an end. She knows that great changes don't happen in revolutions, but in small, daily awakenings. In the instant someone decides to trust a little more, to help without expecting anything in return, or simply to believe they are not alone. Abundance, she repeats, is not a prize to be won. It is the natural state of those who remember their own essence. She walks among images of a world rebuilding itself. People who once received help now help others. Entire communities sustain themselves through cooperation. There is no miracle, no magic. There is awareness. Dolores explains that every gesture, every thought, every word spoken in love modifies the vibration of the collective field. The planet, after all, is a reflection of human intentions. When fear is sown, walls are harvested. When trust is sown, bridges are built. The transformation that began with a simple act of generosity in a forgotten village is now repeated in millions of small gestures around the globe. She pauses and speaks directly to the viewer. Everything you've seen so far isn't about them, she says softly. It's about you. Each of us, she explains, is a living cell of the same organism. When one part awakens, the whole feels it. When a single being changes its vibration, all of humanity moves a few millimeters toward the light. And this change doesn't require wealth, power, or status. It begins in the silent thought that chooses to trust, in the heart that decides to forgive, in the action that springs from love and not fear. Dolores reminds us that energy follows intention. If fear creates scarcity, love creates expansion, and that every daily choice is a seed in the quantum field of reality. When you help someone, she says, you help the whole world. When you believe you are capable, you reinforce humanity's capacity. When you love, the entire universe reorganizes itself. That is why the transformation of the planet does not depend on great leaders, but on ordinary people who, silently, remember who they are. She gazes at the horizon and her voice takes on a firmer, more human tone. The time for theories is over. The world doesn't need more promises. It needs action. Dolores invites each viewer to experience abundance in a concrete way, sharing what they have, listening without judgment, offering help even when no one is looking, and above all, believing that there is enough for everyone. The true revolution is internal. What changes outside is merely a reflection of what changes inside. Then something shifts in the atmosphere. It's as if time dilates. Her words begin to sound like memories everyone already knew but had forgotten. She speaks of the courage to trust in the invisible, of the power born from kindness, and of the importance of acting, even if it seems small. Every small act of love is a portal, she says, and every portal you open helps the planet remember itself. It is at this moment that the viewer understands that there is no separation between spirituality and practical life. Giving, caring, serving, all of this is spirituality in action. Dolores approaches one last time. The light around her intensifies, and her presence becomes almost ethereal. You don't need to wait for the world to change to act, she says. Change begins when one person decides to be the living reminder of what the world has forgotten. Her voice echoes softly, yet firmly, like a direct call to consciousness. Trust the flow. Allow yourself to give, receive, and flow. Every choice based on love is a seed of eternity. The silence that follows is not empty. It is full. It is the kind of silence that comes when the soul understands without needing more words. The viewer feels something awaken within them, an ancient recognition, a desire to act differently, to be part of the healing. Dolores smiles, and before disappearing completely, leaves her last message. You are not learning anything new. You are only remembering. And now the invitation is clear. If something in this video touched you, if for a moment you felt the memory of that which is eternal, don't let that feeling fade. Share it. Comment. Even anonymously. Say what you felt, what changed, what you want to transform. Every word you leave here will become part of the field of light that is being rebuilt. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay connected to this energy. Because in the end, the transformation of the world begins like this, with a memory, a gesture, and the courage to trust that the impossible has always been possible.